recent years, many Wall Street institutions have exerted extraordinary influence in Washington's corridors of power. But Citigroup has risen above the others. Its grip over economic policy making in the executive branch is unprecedented.
At 23 years of age, she was trapped in a never-ending cycle of American poverty, attending college, trying to make a better life, working two low-paying jobs, and one day posted an essay online about her life. That post went viral. What followed was her eye-opening experiences in the book Hand to Mouth, Living in Bootstrap America, and the realization by many that our government and many of our citizens have zero idea how close many people are to living into that poverty line every single day, and how many do it every day. All right, let's welcome the author to MidPoint. Linda Tirado joins us today. Linda, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Ed. And really quickly, I will say thank you so much for the compliment. I was 31 when I wrote the piece, not 23, although I will take 23.
Okay, then I'll tell you what. Then because it is the holiday season, always as a lady, I will stay with 23 just to go ahead and make sure that it makes you happy and things are good.
Oh, you're the sweetest.
Don't worry about it. People around here are still saying that I look young for 112, so you're good. Let's look at the United States government right now and the people in Washington. As I mentioned much earlier in the show, there seems to be a thinking process from our lawmakers that when they gather and Congress is back in session here, that they want to help the middle class. We hear that over and over again, the middle class, making it work. In your opinion and from what you've experienced, do the lawmakers in Washington even know who the middle class is and what they experience on a day-to-day basis?
I would say that anybody who spends 4 hours a day fundraising and is capable of raising enough money to win a seat in Congress is probably fairly out of touch with what it is to work in a restaurant. Now, that said, what is the middle class? Because if you ask somebody at $35,000, they're going to say they're middle class. You ask somebody at $300,000, they're going to say they're middle class too. So it's entirely possible that you've got people representing the interests of the middle class. It's just that they're picking and choosing which middle class they're talking about.
All right, now let's get down to that. What do they need to focus on? Lawmakers are sitting in Washington. You went through a very specific set of circumstances. So if the people in Washington making the rules, the people in Wall Street who basically take care of all the money 24/7, where do they need to look? What do they need to look at to really get a feel for what it's like maybe being in that middle class and, as you experienced, falling out of that and falling into poverty so easily?
I think as a thought exercise, I would love to see everybody take all of their degrees off their resumes. I'd love to see people really get down to what the normal level would be. Say a 55-year-old man who's serving in Congress, well, take away all of that resume. Say that you've been a cook, you've been a laborer. Go and try and find a job, try and find an apartment. See how well that goes for you, and then come back and talk to me about it. Congress has something they call the minimum wage challenge, which is where Congress people try to live just on their food and transportation budgets of the amount that you would have at the minimum wage. And what's interesting to me about that is that they're still wearing the really fancy clothes, and they still have a whole crew of staff around behind them. They still have people to advise them. They have all these resources that they've never even thought of, and they think that it's impossible as it is. A bunch of them drop out before the end of a single week just trying to make it with food and transportation. And when you have that realization, you'll understand that 45 million Americans are living like this. The problem isn't any single congressperson refusing to do their duty. The problem is a system that's been set up that has gone a little too far in one direction. It's a great thing to talk about markets and incentives. I would like to incentivize Congress to make things work for all of America and not just the people that they think are going to donate to their campaigns in the next cycle.
Is that just it, that we have nothing more than politicians sitting here and all they want, make sure they get the money, make sure they get the cars, make sure they get everything else, and they have absolutely no concern whatsoever, Republican or Democrat, who people are on the ground level? I got about 45 seconds before we take a break.
No, I don't think that's true at all. I think they are very concerned. You can look at Paul Ryan's opportunity grant. Clearly, he's really concerned. The problem is they don't understand what solutions might work because they're looking at it from the outside. You never see a Burger King worker on a panel on the Budget Committee advising Congress on how to make policy for Burger King workers.
Is this a Republican or a Democratic fault, in your opinion?
Neither. It's equal. It's the entire society. It's a systemic issue. And to play partisan ball with it is to write off half of that 45 million American who actually probably vote for the other guy. We don't look like anything. We're Republicans, we're Democrats, we're non-voters, we're white, we're black. It doesn't matter. 45 million, it's a third of the country. We're all over the place. All
right, now stand by, please. Linda Tirado returns to MidPoint after the break. We'll dig into what's happening at the moment with the next generation of American leaders. We'll talk about Wall Street a little more and how all these leaders could be failing to make the changes they must master in order to break a cycle of poverty. That and so much more coming up right here on MidPoint, where we question everything. Welcome back to MidPoint, the viral poverty blogger, she's been called, and author of Hand to Mouth, Living in Bootstrap America. Linda Tirado joins us again. Linda, J.P. Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon is the gentleman who made a call to lawmakers on Thursday, urging them to support the omnibus spending bill, basically to weaken Wall Street regulations. What are Americans supposed to take from that? There's a constant hammer away against big business, but to look at somebody like this who basically says, let's weaken them out so that we can make more money.
I mean, look, Jamie Dimon having a Rolodex is no way to make public policy. Let's put it that way. And God bless him for having a Rolodex and doing well for himself. The trouble that I have is when he starts thinking that what's good for him and his business is what's good for me and my family, because it isn't in a lot of cases. When we're talking about repealing Dodd-Frank and weakening those provisions, look, do you know what a synthetic debt obligation is? Do you know what a CDO is? Even Alan Greenspan wasn't 100% and had to go in front of Congress and say there's been a massive flaw in the system. When Alan Greenspan is telling you we're doing it wrong, perhaps we should listen to him for longer than a year or two. And to roll back provisions that were put in place so recently against just this sort of problem is actually a bit of lunacy. And to an average American, you have to look at that and say, why would you do that? If it's not about the money, if it's not about the campaign financing, if it's not about the PACs, the quiet support, why would you do that? I don't see the Citibank provisions and Jamie Dimon's gift to the banking industry as really any different than lifting of the campaign funding caps that we also saw in the omnibus bill, where now we can pretty much spend, I think, something like $1/3 billion to each party if we want to. And I think that when you're talking about money and speech, this last midterm we saw really low turnout and really, really, really high spending, record high spending. And if we're counting money as speech, then I suppose we can say that turnout's actually ticked up a bit, but I don't think that's the sort of speech that we necessarily want to encourage in our political process.
We see a tremendous amount of protests in this country, and there are always the younger generation, the next generation, who is complaining about what's happening. You just mentioned Dodd-Frank. I'll tell you right now that if you say those two words to a lot of people, their eyes glaze over. They have no idea what you're talking about. It completely goes over their head. So from that young protesters side of things, America seems to be galvanizing again. What are they supposed to do? Where are they failing to push this forward? Because it seems as if you want to push somebody to do something, you've got to be smart about it, you've got to be intelligent about it, and you've got to be able to get to them. What are these protesters and the younger generation missing?
The time and the luxury and the energy of knowing what Dodd-Frank is. I am incredibly lucky. I was given a book deal. This is what I do for a living now. And more than that, I was given the blessing of being kind of a wonky nerd to begin with. That is a skill that I was born with. It's a thing that I just happen to have an interest in. A lot of people don't. But you shouldn't have to be able to name the provisions of an obscure budget bill to be able to say there is something wrong in this country when we have less jobs than we have job seekers. And the people who do have jobs are getting them at low wages and part-time, and they're having to sign contracts saying things like, well, I'm only going to work 28 hours a week, but also I agree to not get another job or I'll lose this one. When we're living in situations like that, it doesn't matter. You could name Dodd-Frank, you could name it Barney Frank. It doesn't matter what you name it. The point is that these provisions are taking away autonomy from average Americans, and you don't have to be able to read a budget bill to know that and to understand that that's what's happening. When we see things things like why do poor people have refrigerators being debated in the news, like that's a legitimate question to ask. When we have things like Dodd-Frank, we do have the omnibus bill, but more importantly, we have people on the right and the left just saying, you know what, just don't even worry about it. It's a little above your head. That's problematic to me as an American, and it's problematic to all of these young protesters. The reason people are out protesting is that the situation that we are creating is untenable, and it's going to continue to be so. So unless we start digging ourselves out of the hole, and you talk about the younger people, we're the ones that are going to clean up after this mess.
All right, well, let me interrupt you here for 1 second. I've got about 1 minute. I got about 1 minute, and you just hit on something here. You said digging ourselves out. Would you not agree that also it is a responsibility of that generation, the younger generation, to dig themselves out, to do everything they possibly can to do that, and many times they don't do everything that they can?
Absolutely, but I would say in return, it's the responsibility of the older generations to clean up their own mess. It's not for them to leave it to us. That's what they've done. And trust me, we're digging as hard as we can. We work as hard as we can. We are a generation riddled with debt because we're putting ourselves through school, trying as hard as we can. If you have that kind of scenario, though, our futures aren't as rosy. We're the first generation that's going to have a worse future than our parents. And to look at us and say that that's somehow our fault at our ages, that's giving us a little more credit and power than we've been given thus far, I think.
All right, this is a long conversation. I fear we're going to have it again because certainly, as you mentioned, it is one generation to the next, and it always seems to pass down, and that's unfortunate. Remind everybody once again the book by Linda Tirado. It's called Hand to Mouth, Living in Bootstrap America. Linda, thank you so much for being here. I'm so glad that I could put you in a time machine and youthify you there for a little bit in the first segment. But let me go ahead and wish you and your family a very happy holiday and a Merry Christmas.
And you, Ed. Thank you so much.
Right, take care. Break, and we return with the words and insight of Jennifer Rubin on everything from the Jeb Bush furor to the latest federal judge slapping away at Obamacare. It's on MidPoint.